Here we go. A special episode of the Official Show. I'm Eli Sussman, managing editor at Fish Stripes. You'll be getting podcast episodes from me every Monday during the 2021 Miami Marlins season. As much as possible, trying to get into the habit of posting all these to YouTube as well. Please subscribe to Fish Stripes over there. For the show, I've got my Sixto Sanchez number 45 shirt on. Hope you can see that. Get yours at our partners at Breaking Tea. Just click the link. We're putting it in the episode description on YouTube. Will Sixto even be on the Marlins when the regular season opens on Thursday? Our topic of the day between myself and Ethan Budowsky is figuring out the 26-man active roster that the Marlins are going to put together for Thursday's game against the Rays. And a few decisions on that already coming out as we're recording this here on middle of the morning, Monday. This is breakfast with Eli and Ethan here on mid-Monday morning, right after the Marlins has finished their Grapefruit League schedule. And Ethan has been handling our roster predictions throughout the month, this entire month. And it's been a messy job this year, hasn't it? Trying to fit together all these pieces of this puzzle.
Yeah, well, I also just handled a bowl of Cinnamon Toast Crunch, as you can see. So this is legitimately breakfast with Eli and Ethan. But yeah, it has kind of been a mess. You know, it's the Marlins kind of have this number crunch on their roster, especially in the pen, because they have two Rule 5 draft picks that they definitely don't want to let go, and they have to keep on the roster to start the year. So there is this numbers crunch, especially we know, the bench is how the bench is going to shape out. It's going to be weird. Even though the Marlins have an extra man this year than they would have had, in previous years because the roster has expanded to 26 men, it's still really tight. And there's a lot of races that we still have to figure out. They're starting to come out now who is making these spots. But, I mean, there's still plenty of stuff to figure out in terms of who will make the club and who won't.
Yeah. Ultimately, at the end of this episode, we're going to try to put together a prediction between the two of us. I already have my own prediction. It's up on Twitter. But with this one, I'm going to give you ultimate veto power on this. We'll talk through a lot of the key battles at the end of the bench and, as you mentioned, in the bullpen at the back of the rotation. And I'll try to convince you if we disagree on anything. But ultimately, I'll give you the power to try to make the forecast yourself in terms of how exactly the decisions are going to be made here. For this first part, we want to go through who are what I believe the locks, the ones that are definitely going to be making the roster, barring like a last-second injury or surprise COVID case. So I think I got 9 for the hitting side and then 9 for the pitching side. So yeah, just stop me if any of these have any doubt in your minds about them. On the position player side, Jesus Aguilar, Jorge Alfaro, Brian Anderson, John Birdie, Garrett Cooper, Corey Dickerson, Adam Duvall, Starling Marte, Miguel Rojas. Those guys, we feel pretty confident that they're absolutely on the team.
Well, I mean, there's one guy you're missing there, Eli, and it's the big announcement that the Marlins made yesterday. And Jazz Chisholm Jr. is a lock now because we know that Kim Ng announced during the game yesterday that Jazz won the starting second baseman job. No surprise there, really, based on how the last 2 weeks of spring training unfolded. I'm sure we'll get into breaking that down. But, yeah, you did miss one guy there.
Yeah, so a quick edit already needed that. So this is going to be – that's 10 position players locked in, and we'll see whether it's going to be 12 or 13 total. And in total, 19 locks as we're recording this right now with more updates coming in that we got most of this roster already put together. On the pitching side, 9 locks. Sandy Alcantara, Anthony Bass, Richard Blyer, Dylan Floro, Yimi Garcia, Eliezer Hernandez, Pablo Lopez, and just as we started recording this, we got confirmation about the Rule 5 guys, Zach Pop and Paul Campbell. So all those seem like locks to you?
Yeah, the 3 starters, and then I think we kind of know how the back end of this pen is going to shape out. I think the Marlins paid big money by their standards in the bullpen for Anthony Bass, so I think we all kind of expect him to be the closer. I would personally opt for Yimi Garcia, but I'm sure Yimi is going to get plenty of looks late in games. But Mattingly is one of those guys that likes to have a set closer. So I think at least to start the year, it's going to be Bass. I think Floro's going to get a lot of, mixed up looks. But I think that right now, those are the guys that are kind of locked in. And then obviously we have, it coming out that Campbell and Pop will be here. So it gets interesting, when you get towards the front end of that pen. But did you mention Curtis? I think you did, right?
No, I didn't mention him as a lock.
Interesting.
He's going to be a key guy to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I think his case is interesting for sure.
Right. Yeah. And as you were just touching on with Yimi, Mattingly has that habit of locking in a closer and sticking with him through thick and thin unless things really go off the rails. And honestly, that kind of extends to the setup guys too, where Yimi was just so good in the 8th inning last year. It was a short year, but he's had Yimi dating back to their days with the Dodgers. And now in 2020, when he did so well in the setup role, that I feel that almost works against him in like potentially like being a closer. The fact that if something doesn't work, if something already works, then he doesn't really feel the need to fix it. And that kind of feels like why he might be locked into the exact same role he had last year, unless, something goes wrong with Bass.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely a proponent of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's especially true when it comes to the bullpen. But Yimi did kind of have a rough spring. It wasn't a great spring. I think he started pitching better towards the end, but he had a couple rough outings to start it. So I think that the spring bodes well for Bass because Bass looked pretty good this spring. But there were a lot of guys in the Marlins pen that I thought looked good. But some of them are the guys that are kind of on the fringes. The locks, you don't really pay attention as much to the bullpen locks because they're going to be there. But if you start looking down the line in this pen at some of the guys that are going to be on the fringes that just missed it or might just make it, that's where the pen gets really interesting. And I think it's why I believe that this pen is going to be better than a lot of people believed coming into the season. People kind of thought that the Marlins, they said they were going to try and improve the pen and they just kind of like pieced it together. But I think they actually did a really good job of getting a pen that can win them ball games in order.
Yeah, we're gonna hop back to the pen in a little bit and go deep into that because of all the roster flexibility they have there. The easier side, I think, is the position players. We already got 10, and that's 10 with Jazz Chisholm Jr. being starting second baseman, and Isan Diaz hasn't officially happened at this moment, but he's going to be optioned down to the fish tank. That's what we're calling it, not the alternate training site. I wanted to go with the fish tank and make that. So
bring back the nostalgia of Pro Player Stadium.
He'll be heading up to Jacksonville to start the year, and we'll see what happens from there. The rest of the roster, we could start with the backup catcher. I think this has been pretty clear throughout spring. I mean, Mattingly's been very consistent about it, that Chad Wallach is the only other catcher right now on the 40-man roster, and he was catching the games last year in the postseason, all the games in the postseason. He's had a bad spring, at least offensively, but at the same time, he's been working with a lot of different pitchers, and all those pitchers that have been impressing in spring, a lot of them have been working with Wallach as well. That to me, I would have him pretty much as a lock. I know that you had some reservations about that, and the differences between him and someone like Sandy Leon.
Yeah, well, Chad Wallach is a backup catcher. Let's make that clear. And backup catchers in the MLB, what they do. They provide defense. They provide relief for the guy that's catching every day, because you're not going to send your starting catcher out there 162 games. And they just kind of, they don't provide a lot of offensive value. You're finding offensive value out of the catcher in general is very tough. That's why a guy like JT Realmuto is so valuable. But I just think that you want to find some kind of offensive potential somewhere, and Sandy Leon showed a lot more this spring. Obviously, the problem is Wallach is really good with Pablo, so they love that the relationship that he's built with Pablo. He's kind of Pablo's guy. How like Lester had Ross, and then Darvish pitched with Caratini instead of Contreras for the Cubs last year. Some guys just have their guy, and Wallach seems to be Pablo's guy. And the other thing is that, as you mentioned, he pitched in the he caught in the postseason last year. So clearly the Marlins really value the relationship that he has with their young starting pitchers. To me, I think Sandy Leon can kind of bring the same thing. He's a veteran catcher. He's caught a lot of greats. There were a lot of really good pitchers that wanted to work with him, and he brings a little more offensive potential, as we saw this spring. But it's not realistic. I think I agree with you. We'll have to see how much the Marlins valued his spring over Wallach's spring. But I think at the end of the day, Mattingly, like you said, has always talked about the fact that he's going to be the second catcher on the roster. So I think he's on. is he under more pressure now because of hold on, sorry. Is he under pressure now because of how spring went? Yeah, I think so, because Leon was really productive during spring, and we'll see how he does. He'll probably go to Jacksonville. But it's an interesting choice, but I definitely think Wallach will, squeak on. But how much more value does he really bring than a guy like Leon? I'm not really sure.
Now, with Leon, just to put the numbers behind it, hit 333 this spring, 474 on base, 467 slugging. That's a 940 OPS. It's only 19 plate appearances, and Wallach a little bit more playing time, 26 plate appearances, and he hit 120 with no power. So it was ugly. But with that being said, I know I probably know a little bit more about Sandy than the average person, because he played Colombian winter ball with Harold Ramirez.
And I know you were keeping an eye on Harold down at Columbia for sure. Yeah,
at least during the end of their regular season and the playoffs. I don't even want to admit how many games I probably watched of them together. At least 10 or 12. And in Columbia, playing against really low level competition, to be frank, Sandy wasn't particularly good. I think he had maybe one or two home runs, but aside from that, like a sub 200 batting average, and a lot of weak contact when he wasn't like totally squaring up the ball. And you look at his regular season stats, 2018 to 2020, he's been one of the worst hitters in the majors. He's been right down there with someone we're about to get into, Lewis Brinson. He's been right down there. He's been, despite what he did this spring, I understand, a little bit of excitement about that. But over a larger sample in the regular season, he's been honestly even worse than Wallach has offensively. So I think,
and that's why I think it raised a lot of eyebrows, right, when the Marlins, signed him, because a lot of people, frankly, were ready to move on from Jorge Alfaro this summer, or this winter. A lot of Marlins fans were saying, go get Wilson Contreras, go throw in the house for Wilson Contreras. Go find yourselves a true, a catcher, make Alfaro, your backup catcher, because if Alfaro's your backup catcher, you're doing pretty well. So I think a lot of eyebrows were kind of raised when the Marlins, signed Sandy Leon, and people thought, okay, this is the guy that, they think could bring offensive value and could be a major league catcher. But at the end of the day, like you said, he hasn't been very good at all. He's been pretty bad. So, far below MLB replacement level. So I just kind of think that, yeah, over 162 games, he would probably end up seeing that same kind of production. And it's not like Wallach brings you, too much more. Maybe it's a couple more home runs. But that's just the life of trying to find a good backup catcher, is you're not going to really find one that brings a ton of offensive value. So you just kind of got to live with what you have. And I think you got to go with the guy that you feel works best with your pitching staff when he has to come in.
Yeah. To fill out the position player side, we know Donnie has been saying all along he likes having a deep bench. He likes having 13 position players. And I guess at this point, that's the assumption I'm making, that they're going to do that. Personally,
yeah. Well, somebody asked Mattingly about this a couple weeks ago, maybe a week or so ago, and he said that they're going with 13-13. So actually, on my opening day roster prediction articles that I wrote, I went with 14 and 12. I had the Marlins only taking 4 bench players, which is why Lewis Brinson got left off on my 2 roster predictions. But it was because of that numbers crunch that we talked about in the bullpen, the Marlins just kind of having too many arms. But Mattingly says they're going to go 13-13, at least to start the year. And so that opens up another bench spot, and it also, makes it tighter in the bullpen. So he has said that it'll be 13-13.
And we think those last 2 guys on the hitting side, most likely Magneuris Sierra and Lewis Brinson. I mean, Sierra is out of options. He's another guy that hasn't really done much at all this spring. Hitting 129, no extra base hits, and 34 plate appearances. But defensively, he can do it all. He's right up there with like the best, most versatile defenders they have. When he does get on base, which he did a lot of last year during the 2020 regular season, he's so dynamic. Someone that, even though he's not going to get that many starts behind Corey Dickerson and Adam Duvall, but he's an obvious guy to pinch run for them in key situations and take over as a defensive replacement. So he's someone that I've felt pretty sure all along is going to be in there, and honestly doesn't have a ton of trade value anyway. Like if you don't keep him on the roster, I just don't think you're going to get much back at all to be like satisfied about. Might not get anything at all. Might just be claimed by some other team. And Brinson was the tricky one. I mean, we know he's the king of spring. Every single year he is dominant in spring training games. This year had a little slump in the middle. Overall stats, though, look pretty decent. I mean, he had 258 and 827 OPS. A lot of hard contact, even when those balls weren't landing. I mean, this is the second straight spring where he's made a lot of contact, where that strikeout issue hasn't been there. Only a 20% K rate this spring, which is a lot better than league average. And he's someone that he has an option remaining. So he was someone that I had anticipated that he'd be the obvious guy to send down if they had trying to carry 14 pitchers to begin the season. With no DH, I guess that actually helps him, that he's a guy that you can get pinch hitting at bats for against lefties almost every game, assuming that you line him up against a lefty, even though he's not going to be the primary high leverage pinch hitting option. Like, you could do something with him. Honestly, I think he could still get optioned very early in the year. I think there may be a point where they do have to go with an extra pitcher and he'd be the odd man out. At least for opening day, though, you can see that tiny, somewhat significant role that he could still have on this team.
Yeah, no, I think there's, value to be had with Lou Brinson, and I'm definitely a Lou apologist because I really like the guy. And, the way his career has gone is very unfortunate. And so I'm still rooting for him to, have like a Byron Buxton type revival where, you're crap for years and everybody just kind of gives up on you. And then all of a sudden you turn yourself into a valuable player. I think the Marlins have this logjam in the outfield, so I'm not sure he'll be the starting center fielder the way Buxton has become for Minnesota. But I think there is a role to play, and I think we saw his role last year, which is what you talked about. He's really good against lefties, and he was really good against lefties again during the spring. And the other thing is he's dropping his K rate. You talked about how he's always the king of the spring, but that's because he launches a few dingers and gets everybody excited, but he still was K'ing at like a 30% rate those springs. And people just kind of forgot that because he hit a couple bombs or whatever. But I think at the end of the day, I thought this spring was where he looked the best. Like you said, he wasn't striking out. He was hitting the ball hard. He was making a lot of contact. Every time he hit the ball, it was pretty much hard. So I think he has a valuable role on this team, especially, like you talked about with Mags, his defense and his base running. The Marlins, as a base running team, are a lot better than I think a lot of people realize. I think the Marlins as a whole team are a lot better than people realize. But one aspect of their team that we don't really talk about a lot is base running. You have a guy like Sierra. You have a guy like Brinson. You have a guy like Jazz who runs better than we give him credit for. Marte has been a great base runner throughout his career. And Donnie kind of talked about this during spring that, they had some mistakes on the base paths, but that kind of comes with it. But he likes the way that they're running the bases. They're being aggressive. You saw guys like Blade triple. You saw Lou tripled, the other night. A lot of guys are kind of taking that extra base. And so I think that his base running, just like Mags, brings a lot of value to the team. And against lefties, Cooper will be the first guy off the bench, hypothetically. He's going to get a lot of starts, but when he's not starting, the first guy you're going to opt for against lefties is Garrett Cooper. I think he's the first guy you're going to opt for against righties or lefties because you need to get him ABs because of how productive he was this spring. But I definitely think that, you're going to face lefties. You're going to face tough lefties. And Lou did a really good job against them last year. He did a really good job in spring against them. So I think, if you just plug him into this role of you're going to be our lefty platoon guy, and get him a couple starts against lefties for Dickerson if he needs a day off or whatever, I think there's at-bats to be had for Lewis Brinson on this team, and there's value to be brought. With Sierra, Monte Harrison isn't on the roster this year. He was on the roster I don't know if it was from opening day or if it was after all the COVID call-ups, but he was on the roster and played a huge role defensively and with base running last year. He won the Marlins some games by creating runs. He also lost that Braves game with his base running. But I think Sierra's going to kind of play that Monte Harrison role where he plays defense late. They bring him on to pinch run late, and he is very good. He can play all three outfield positions. So he's got plenty of value. But like you said, he's just they just can't get rid of him. He just has a little too much value because of what he can do defensively and on the base pass to get rid of him. But you're not going to get anything for him if you do. So it's he's in this weird purgatory right now where the Marlins are kind of forced to keep him. But I don't know how big of a role he plays, but there's definitely some value there in his legs, I'd say.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm on the record when they DFA'd Harold Ramirez. I was the one saying that you should have let Brinson go instead. You should have cut the cord with Brinson before spring training, before being blinded by this. I mean, that decision, I think, is aging pretty well for them so far, especially with the news that still, I mean, no DH being announced a few days before the start of the season. My assumption was that deal would be ironed out between the league and the players union. And right now that's looking very unlikely. And Brinson is just a much better fit with the National League game. So yeah, we're agreed, I guess, on these 13 position players: Aguilar, Alfaro, B.A., Birdie, Cooper, Dickerson, Duvall, Marte, Miggy Rowe, Jazz, Brinson, Sierra, and Chad Wallach. That's a 13. And that's going to just leave 4 more spots to figure out on this pitching staff, but that's a lot easier said than done. We had our.
By the way, I just want to say, I think that lineup is a lot better than people give it credit for, especially, it gets, look, the bench, there's not a lot of depth there. There's depth in the Marlins system, but there's not a lot of depth at the major league level right now. But that 1 through 9, that 1 through 9 that you're going to be putting out there every day, and if the DH magically appears, which I could rant for 30 minutes about the DH, but I'm going to spare the listeners that, that 1 through 8, that 1 through 9, whatever you're going to be putting out there every day is really solid. It's a solid major league lineup. You've got the two guys at the top have been productive major league hitters for a long time, especially Starling Marte is just an awesome baseball player. He had a great spring. Aguilar is going to bring pop, and if it's not Aguilar, it's Cooper. If it's not Duvall hitting dingers every day, it's Cooper. Miggy Rowe has been productive. B.A. had a rough spring, but you know what you're going to get out of B.A. Nobody's really worried about him. And then, we'll see what Jazz. He has so much potential. We'll see. But I think this lineup is going to be better than a lot of people think.
Absolutely. I mean, not just the hitting, but just their all-around game too. Like some of these players just being underappreciated because they're either unestablished or don't have the highest ceilings. But that's definitely something
the defensive side of the ball too is something that Mattingly talked about a lot this spring, where, simple things like cutting balls off in gaps that prevent, singles from being doubles or doubles from being triples. The Marlins are fundamentally sound, I think, really, and they'll win some ball games. I think they'll surprise some people, especially on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah. Moving to the rest of this pitching staff, trying to figure out 4 more spots to go along with Alcantara, Bass, Blyer, Floro, Yimi, Hernandez, Lopez, Pop, and Campbell. What makes it so complicated is just the flexibility. I mean, the only guys on this team that on the pitching staff that don't have any minor league options left are Bass, Blyer, Bass, Gimme, and Ross Detweiler. So I didn't mention Ross Detweiler as a lock. To me, he is a lock because he's on a guaranteed deal. They paid, I think, $850,000 to him early in the offseason. A very underwhelming deal. I wasn't too thrilled with that, being a guy that has a long major league track record, but not a particularly good one. And now they're just having him as a reliever, the second lefty in this bullpen to go along with Blyer. And I still think he makes a team because they wouldn't have made that commitment to him if they didn't really believe in him. And just to review what he did this spring, it was pretty ugly. Overall, what was it? A 6.75 ERA, a 2.10 whip, more than 2 base runners per inning. And he finished it on a pretty sketchy note, too. He faced the Cardinals, I think, on Saturday in their second to last game, and he loaded the bases and he wiggled out of it. But overall, I mean, batting average against 393, OPS against 1,040. So in that small sample, it was really unimpressive. The key to him last year with the White Sox was like the slider that he's fine-tuned, this slider cutter thing that finally misses some bats. And it was really inconsistent this spring. Like I remember several individual at-bats where he had guys on the ropes with 2 strikes, and then he just wasn't locating it well enough to put them away. So it raises a red flag. But with him, he's on that guaranteed deal, and he was brought in by Kim Ng, one of Kim Ng's, actually her first major league free agent signing after taking over the job. I have to think he's on the roster, at least for the early portion of the year.
Yeah, I mean, the Marlins aren't going to go into the season with one lefty, and I don't think that they're going to put Castano in the pen. I think he's either going to start at the major league level or he's going to start in Jacksonville and come up and come down as needed. So you can't go into the season with only one lefty. So I think he's got to be there. He doesn't have an option, like you said. He's got guaranteed money. Yeah, I agree. I would have liked to see the Marlins go in a different direction in free agency in terms of lefty relievers. I'm not necessarily saying throw $10 million or whatever Brad Hand got at him, but because they clearly didn't have that money this offseason, but I think going forward they will. But he's just one of those relievers that's been around the yard, and you kind of know what he brings. He had a good year last year, but like you said, if that slider's not going to be what it was last year, then he's not going to have the same success. It's just a lefty reliever, you have to have him. And so I think that, he's pretty much on this roster, unless they want to bring in Castano to be their swing guy and they keep him on this roster. But, $850,000 guaranteed dollars, they're not going to cut that. So I think he makes the roster, but I agree with you. It was a very underwhelming signing. There wasn't much to say about it, really. It was just kind of, okay, you're signing Ross Detweiler. Everybody knows that name because he's just kind of, in 15 years, he'll be on my random MLB player thread. You know what I mean? So he's just kind of there. That's really what it is. He's just kind of there because he's a lefty, and, maybe the Marlins find a lefty somewhere that they like better. But, for now, I think he's got to be there.
Well, I mean, that moves us on to the most impressive lefty that was in this situation, battling for a job. That was Trevor Rogers, who's he's a nominee. He's a finalist for our Marlin of the Month award. You can vote for that on Fish Stripes, or I think it's our pinned tweet on Twitter. Vote either today, tomorrow, and then we'll give that out. He's a finalist because he had the second most strikeouts in Major League Baseball this spring, behind only Lucas Giolito, 29 Ks.
Oh, Giolito got him at the end.
At the very end, yeah. I put out an article because I was curious whether spring strikeouts are like total nonsense or whether there's something interesting there. And I was kind of amazed that every single year, the guy that leads spring training in strikeouts is a very legit pitcher. There's been Max Scherzer, there's been Kyle Hendricks, there's been Francisco Liriano when he was in his heyday. There's been Madison Bumgarner, who I found some very interesting. It's a stretch, but I found some interesting parallels between Mad Bum and Trevor Rogers. He was incredible, a guy that added on some weight this offseason, and that has already had some immediate dividends. His fastball velo is sitting nice in the mid-90s, and he's got that great changeup already. The improvement in his slider, you can see it, and you can actually measure it. His spin rate is up on that pitch. He's got a great three-pitch mix, and he's got command, and he's got all these long limbs that he gets really close to the plate when he delivers, that there's a reason why everybody's picking him to be a breakout candidate. Despite no AAA experience, very little AA experience. When he's in the majors last year, he had some inconsistent bottom line results, but it doesn't take much to see this guy and know that he is ready to be a major league starter. So we'll talk about him right now. That the fit on the pitching staff for opening day, it's a little awkward. You don't know exactly where, but I think it's an automatic that he will be on that roster, that he'll be a guy. He's not going to be starting one of the first 3 games of the season. That's going to be Sandy and then Pablo and then Eliezer. But I think he's going to be on the opening day roster, available in relief if they need him, and someone that lines up to start one of the first games of the next series that they have next Monday and Tuesday, that he's going to make the team. You can't keep him off the team when his talent is just this obvious.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I just want to be clear. The Marlins have until Tuesday night to set their roster, right?
Either Tuesday night or might actually be Wednesday.
Okay.
So
the reason I asked that, Eli, is because Sixto's throwing tomorrow, and so the way he throws tomorrow, I think, will kind of determine if Sixto makes the roster or not. For those that don't know, Sixto had a false positive for COVID at the beginning of camp. That set him back. He only made 4 appearances, right? Yeah, only 4 spring appearances, whereas most of the other starters made 5 or 6. Whether that.
Sorry, my mic got unplugged apparently. Could you hear me the whole time?
We lost you for a second, the last like 15 seconds of that. About Sixto and his readiness.
Okay, my bad.
Yeah.
Okay. So Sixto, had this false positive at the beginning of camp for COVID. That sent him back. He only got to throw 4 starts, whereas the other, mainstays in the rotation, as you would say, got to throw 5 or 6. So he throws tomorrow, and depending on how he throws tomorrow, will probably determine if he catches up in time and makes the opening day roster. That means that there's either 1 spot or 2 spots left, right? And the 2 guys fighting for those spots would be Neidert and Rogers. I think Castano those guys were so good that they kind of boxed Castano out a little bit from this competition.
Agreed.
But
Yeah.
Rogers was incredible. I mean, he was just tremendous. Like you said, he was second in the major leagues in strikeouts. He bested Sandy when it comes to strikeouts this spring. He was, tremendous last year. He had a K per 9 above 12 in his 6 or 7 starts last year. So the Marlins are really excited about this guy, and Marlins fans are really excited about this guy. People would not let me say that Neidert should be the guy over Rogers. And I think that Rogers with this last start kind of proved them right. He had 10 Ks in 6 innings. He worked so tremendously. He wasn't facing the Astros A lineup by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think any of their top guys were in the lineup. But to strike out 10 guys in a spring training game in 6 innings, to strike out 10 guys in any game is very impressive. So, like you said, Trevor, Mattingly talked about how he's bigger, he's stronger, he looks better, his velo's up, his slider looks great. We know he's got that nasty changeup. And I've been a proponent that, only 5 starts in AA matters to me. I've said that he should go get some fine tuning because there were some things last year that worried me. He was not getting as much swing and miss because he was realizing that, major league hitters are more disciplined than high A and AA hitters. But boy, was he really good this spring. And I think he just kind of forced the Marlins' hand. And I think Neidert, there's got to be a spot for Neidert somewhere on this team. He was also really great this spring. People talk like because Trevor was so good, it means Neidert wasn't really good. But Neidert was really freaking good this spring. And so I kind of think that you also have to find him a spot. But I think, it doesn't look likely that Sixto is going to make the opening day roster personally to me. I think he'll throw 1 more start at the alternate training site on I wrote it in the article that I wrote recently. I can't remember which article it was, but I wrote an article recently. And Sixto would have to make 1 more start on like April 4th. And the Marlins have an off day that day, so he could make that start at the alternate training site, then fly to New York with them and pitch in the New York series. Because it would be the Cardinals on the 5th, whatever. Anyway, I think he's going to end up making his first start on April 10th against the Mets. He'll fly to New York with them, and I think that's where you'll see him make his debut. But you never know. Sixto says that he only needs 1 more start. We'll see how it goes with the Marlins. But if Sixto, doesn't make it, it makes it really easy because then Neidert and Rogers will both make a start to start the season. And then you can kind of judge based on their first starts who stays. But Rogers was so good. So good. So I think I agree with you, Eli, that, he'll end up being the 5th guy, when Sixto is all up. And then it gets interesting, do the Marlins make a move to bring Neidert up? Do they love Neidert that much? I know they're really high on him. Donnie said he almost made it as the 5th starter going into the regular season if COVID hadn't shortened the year. So we'll see. It's gonna be interesting, but yeah, Trevor was fantastic. I think he'll be in the majors for this year for sure, to start this year for sure.
The Sixto situation seems pretty clear cut to me. You said he's going to make that next start tomorrow on Tuesday, that next stretch out start. And then he does that start on Tuesday. And is he going to be available to pitch 2 days later on Thursday on opening day? No, they're not even going to consider. You wouldn't be an option to appear in the opening day game under any circumstances, even if it goes 30 innings. And to me, I think that factor alone is pretty clear as to why he won't be on the opening day roster, that you're going to see changes to this roster within a few days after opening day,
Definitely.
which is why maybe we shouldn't be spending all this time talking about it because it's such a small fragment of the season. But that to me, it's as simple as that, where he could be ready potentially as soon as that second series of the regular season, or if not, maybe even more likely on that first road trip against the Mets. But if he is throwing a full-length start or close to it on Tuesday, he's not going to be available to pitch on Thursday. They'll want to put guys who are available to pitch on their active roster.
Right.
And I think that makes the decision just a no-brainer for him. Are they going to sell more tickets to the opening series just for people to watch Sixto in the dugout or like in the bullpen just to sit there and wave to him? I don't think so. I don't think that really moves the needle that much. So even though they think the world of Sixto, they're also very protective of him. And these setbacks have been unfortunate because, of course, if not for COVID and if not for a visa issue before that, he would have been on the opening day roster for sure. He would be one of their top five starters.
No doubt.
I think as impressive as Rogers has been, Nick Neidert is probably the one that gets squeezed off in that situation. But in the reality we're living in, Sixto is just a little far enough behind schedule that he's going to come up as soon as he's ready, but he's not quite ready for April 1st. So with that said, we have Rogers in, and this makes it pretty easy, in my opinion, that Neidert is going to have a role on that opening day roster. I don't know if he makes a start, and I don't know if he even pitches. But if you're starting the season and they have this 13-man bench, which is only 13 pitchers, then I think it has value, of course, to have another arm on that roster that's already relatively stretched out for not quite full starter duty, but for multi-inning relief. And you could talk about Neidert a little bit. He was really impressive this spring as well. Not as dominant as Rogers, but very close to that. And this is a guy that's been majorly ready for a couple years now and just hasn't gotten the opportunity due to some bad luck with his injury and then with COVID. So at this point, the doors, I think, have opened for him pretty conveniently, at least for the first few days of the season.
Yeah. And the Marlins have this weird scheduling quirk this year where they have an off day on Sunday, and that kind of breaks up their first series and then their next series against the Cardinals. And that's interesting because when do you ever get off, the first series on a Sunday? It feels like everybody plays on that Sunday. When do you ever get off any Sunday in Major League Baseball? So there's this weird scheduling quirk where that Sunday is the day that Sixto is scheduled to throw in it would be in Jupiter, he's scheduled to throw that day. So do you want to keep him on every 5 days and then have the extra day that he takes be when they have another off day in New York on his scheduled day? Or are you just going to say, here, buddy, take the day off and come back and let's start you on that Monday? I don't think that's going to happen. And because of that, I think Neidert gets on. And look, Neidert was awesome this spring. I mean, he had the same ERA. Him and Rogers had the same ERA at 2.84. His WHIP was just a little higher. I think it was like 1.11. He struck a bunch of guys out. He was really good. I really loved watching Neidert this spring. And up until like his second to last start, he hadn't allowed a run. But yeah, it's interesting because Donnie spoke so highly of him. He said this guy was almost our fifth starter before he got hurt in spring training. And then, the COVID shut the season down, shut the spring training down. And then when they came back, he wasn't quite built up to be a starter. So he was in that bullpen role. Then he got COVID. So he had some bad luck the way that Sixto has had bad luck this spring, right? Sixto, there's nothing else to it. If your test comes back positive, but you don't actually have COVID, that's just bad luck, So Neidert had some bad luck last year, and now he might get some bad luck this year in that he was great this spring, but Rogers was just better, So I think there's a role for him to play. Like, I think that if he doesn't start, as a starter, maybe he starts as a bullpen arm because he did last year before COVID shut the season down. He pitched a couple innings in relief in Philadelphia. But, I mean, this guy's been really good. And so for me, I've said I think his ceiling, what he is he's closer to a 3 than he is to a 5, right? So I think that we always said that his ceiling was a 3 and his floor was a 5 or like a AAA guy. And I think he's a lot closer to his ceiling. And you kind of saw that this spring because he was so good. So for me, it's really hard to leave him off. And he, because he was so fantastic. But like we keep saying, Rogers was just too good. And so, yeah, I think he'll make one start. I think all of these guys will make one start. And then Sixto, they'll on that off day, they'll bring Sixto up or whatever when they're in New York because they have another off day then. So the schedule is always weird at the beginning of the season. There's always like some built-in off days because of they don't want to, have weather problems and stuff early in the season. But yeah, I don't really know how the Marlins have a good problem on their hand, right? I kept saying this is that I don't really know how you pick between the two, but it's a good problem to have to say we have these two young starters. Both of them are top, 10 to 15 prospects in our system. They were both great in spring. Which one do we pick? That's not a bad problem to have.
Well, this is where the real problem starts because we're now down to one spot on the whole roster. We've gone through 25 out of 26. We got one spot left. We know Craig Mish has been reporting right before we went on air that James Hoyt is going to be optioned down to the minors. This is James Hoyt, who had a 1.23 ERA last season out of the Marlins pen. He's a really funky guy, almost entirely relies on his slider against righties and lefties, and he had a lot of success with that. He was someone that Mattingly trusted in critical situations to put out the fire in the middle of the inning and a lot of high leverage situations. He was great at stranding inherited runners for most of the year. He was great, but he's someone that has a very mixed track record in the pros. He's already 34 years old. And like so many of the other guys on the staff, he had, I think, multiple minor league options to go, or at least one. And that decision's been made. It was not a surprise to me just because we've seen him this spring and he was not good this spring. He was someone that was he just did not have the same feel for his slider as usual. He couldn't locate it. Wild pitches, hit by pitches, hard contact, you name it. I think he finished a little bit better than he started, but it's an understandable decision. Also, Anthony Bender, #BenderMania, someone that I've had my eye on throughout all spring. It just took like 2 innings of spring for me to really latch onto him to realize that, wow, this guy has a plus fastball. He has a plus slider. He throws them both for strikes. I don't know where he came from. He came from the Brewers organization and then from independent ball, why they were able to get him on a minor league deal and why they were able to do that and what other teams are missing. I'm not sure, but they got a gem in him. He's going to be going to the fish tank as well, not on the roster. So that doesn't even need to be optioned yet. He's still just technically a minor leaguer, but he had a scoreless spring training. Like the velocity held up all throughout spring, 97, 98. He was the hardest thrower in Marlins camp this year. And that's saying something to be the guy that has the best velo. And he was tested. He faced some like legit major leaguers during that final weekend of the spring. He pitched on back-to-back days. He flirted with some trouble. Like, I think you can see that he's not like a perfectly polished pitcher. There have been people that have been trying to tell me Nick Anderson 2.0, next Nick Anderson. And I think that's jumping way too far ahead, but because he hasn't done it in real games yet. But at the very least, he's someone that is going to be one of the first guys up when there is an issue in the bullpen, when there's an injury or when someone gets hurt, that you will almost absolutely see him in the majors this year. So he's on the outside looking in, which really makes this.
And I just want to say one thing about him is you mentioned that you don't really know where he came from. Donnie didn't really know where he came from either, which was the funny thing. I think somebody specifically asked him, like, where did this guy come from? And Mattingly didn't really know. But yeah, he was awesome this spring. I think he was kind of like that, there's one guy every spring that just kind of comes out of nowhere and impresses. And he was great. He kind of took the world by storm. He did have some problems. He gave up some hard contact. And so it's like, okay, how sustainable could this be? You're throwing hard and it's coming hard back at you. But he looked really good. And Donnie said he's got major league stuff. So first guy up, I would say probably, maybe it's Hoyt because of how good he was last year and because of his major league experience. But the Marlins have said they're going to take the guys that give them the best chance to win games. They're done with giving guys opportunities. And if they feel that Bender gives them the best chance to win games because his stuff has more potential, then they're going to go with him. So, it's going to be between those two for first guy up, I would say.
Right. In the meantime, we still got this one more spot to play with on the pitching staff. And to me, there's 3 candidates, potentially, and really just 2. But technically, Daniel Castano, I mean, he was really good for them last year, and Donnie likes him. And a lot, I mean, he's such an easy guy to root for. His velo was up a little bit this spring, but we've already kind of covered it that he's most valuable in that, like, spot starter, multi-inning relief role. And they seem to have that covered already between Rogers and Neidert and Paul Campbell, that he would be a big surprise if they put him on the roster. They already have a couple of lefties, of course, as well. So that really leaves Adam Cimber, 2 new guys. Adam Cimber, acquired over the offseason from Cleveland, and then John Curtis, who they got in a trade from Tampa Bay. Both of them pretty productive this spring. As I said in the beginning of the show, I'm going to give you the ultimate veto power on this, that I want to hear which one that you would go with first. And if we disagree, I'll give you my reasons for it. But just curious to think which one of them, or if you have somebody really off the board that you think gets the very final spot on the roster.
No, this is the 2 guys. And it's difficult because Donnie has mentioned them both as multiple inning guys. So, it's not like you're picking between a guy that can go 1 inning or a guy that can give you 2 or 3. You're picking between 2 guys that can give you a couple innings at a time. The thing is, Curtis is kind of more versatile, I feel like. He opened for the Rays, so he can start. He did the high leverage stuff. He did the middle relief stuff. So I think that if you're going to opt for versatility, then you're going to go with Curtis. And also, he was pretty good in the majors last year. Cimber is a guy that he gives you a different look, right? Because he's got that weird release. Is he a sidearm or a submariner? Are they different things, really? But he gives you that. Go ahead.
I think he's technically a submariner. I think he's far down enough that it's technically submarine. Yeah.
So if you want a guy that gives you a different look, I've never been a fan of submariners. I think they're kind of unsustainable, right? Like there's a few guys that have kind of made careers out of it. Like who's the reliever for is it Darren O'Day, right?
Yeah, Darren O'Day's one. And Cimber says specifically that he was kind of following in the school of Brad Ziegler.
Okay, former Marlin. But it's like I don't know how sustainable that submariner is. I think guys kind of either they figure it out eventually, or they're a little too wild, or whatever the case may be. So you're opting for multi-inning guy or multi-inning guy there. So that's the choice. But now the choice becomes: do you want versatility, or do you want to give people a different look? Right? Do you want to give teams this submariner look? Or do you want the guy that can, play multiple roles? I would personally opt for, and this is a tough decision because I had both these guys on my roster when the Marlins had, when I thought the Marlins were going with 9 pitchers because of the number crunch. But this is where they get squeezed because they have to keep 2 Rule 5 picks. And both those guys, it's not like you're going to pass on one of those 2 Rule 5 guys because they both have a lot of potential. Pop was one of the better relievers in camp this year. And Campbell is a multi-inning guy. He can play a swing role. I thought his stuff is really good. He's just kind of got to locate it better, But I would go with Curtis because I would go with versatility. In a COVID year, you're going to need this is still a COVID year. Look, let's not forget about that, right? There's probably still going to be guys that test positive for COVID. Hopefully, MLB gets started on the vaccines with players. I know, I saw the Astros are stopping on the way from spring to their opening series in Houston to all get their first vaccination. I don't know if they're getting Johnson & Johnson, so maybe they'll be good. But, maybe MLB starts revving up the vaccination and these teams start staying out of it. But it's a COVID year still. You're still going to have teams are still going to have to deal with this. So in a COVID year, we saw what happened last year, right? We saw how much versatility you need. I would opt for versatility. I would opt for the guy that can play multiple roles, that can be a back end guy, he can be a mid guy, or he can give you, a spot, maybe not a spot start, but a spot open, just kind of eat some innings here and there. I would go with Curtis. I also think his stuff has a little more potential. So that would be my pick. It's a tight pick, man. I mean, these 2 guys, they were both brought in trades, so the Marlins clearly value them. there's value to both of them, but I would just go with Curtis. I don't know. I don't know how to pick between the two because it's kind of like they're, when you get down to these relievers, they're all kind of the same guy. But yeah, I would go with versatility here.
I personally would go with Curtis too. On top of everything you mentioned, they did give up more to acquire him. I mean, to acquire Cimber, it was just cash considerations. To acquire Curtis, they gave up one of their early 2019 draft picks, Evan Edwards, who's got some interesting promise. They more invested in Curtis, and he was better last year. I mean, Cimber missed some time last season. He had some things that were off kilter with his unique release point, and if he doesn't have the right release point on that, his stuff is
useless. Yeah, exactly.
With that being said, I mean, my prediction is that it's going to be Cimber over Curtis. Reasons being, I mean, you did mention it from both Donnie and also from Kim Eng on multiple occasions about how much she values having different looks out of the bullpen. I mean, and that's not only working in favor of Cimber, but I think that works against Curtis, because you look at these other relievers that we already put on the team. I mean, the ones that are locked in are Anthony Bass and Yimi Garcia. Who are those guys? They're tall right-handers who throw mid-90s fastball with like a wipeout slider. Zach Pop made the roster. We agree that Zach Pop should have made the roster. His movement is a little bit unique, but I mean, the profile is very similar to those other guys.
Fastball, wipeout slider. Yeah,
exactly. In the same type of release point as those other guys as well. If you're in a game situation and you get 5 tough innings from Eliezer Hernandez, and they turn over to the bullpen with a 1-run lead, and you go to the bullpen, and first it's Zach Pop, and then, for example, it's John Curtis, and then it's Yimi Garcia, and then it's Anthony Bass. I mean, you have 4 guys that are throwing the same way, and most of these hitters in the other lineup are going to face that's multiple times through the lineup for that other team, where they just saw a guy in the 6th or 7th inning that looks a lot like the guy in the 8th or 9th inning. In a vacuum, they're all good pitchers. But this is a situation where you line them up like that, even though you like them, that they don't get the results that you're anticipating because the hitters are really comfortable because they've seen that in the previous plate appearance. So maybe this is me overthinking it, but the hints have been there from everybody involved about how much they value having that different look. With Cimber is someone that, I mean, he's more of a specialist. I think you're correct in saying that Curtis is the more versatile pitcher and probably the more valuable pitcher over the course of a long season. Cimber is a guy that when he's on top of his game, he is dominant against right-handed batters because of his release point and his stuff. He's also someone that probably even more so than Curtis is comfortable coming into the middle innings. So to me, really why I give it to Cimber is also because of what we mentioned about James Hoyt, where James Hoyt was the guy last year that Donnie liked to go to against right-handed hitters in those tricky situations when his starter was running out of gas, entering in the middle of the inning. And having both of them on the roster, Cimber and Hoyt, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think that's inefficient. And like I said, overall, those guys have somewhat limited upside. But the fact that they sent down Hoyt, to me, that raised alarm bells that Cimber was the guy that they were putting in, that they wanted one of those type of guys to have this very specific role in the bullpen. And if he struggles, then that's when they call up Hoyt, or maybe they make that bold decision to just go with power arms everywhere, as many as possible. And that's not a bad decision. There have been some great bullpens that are built almost entirely on power arms that work that way. But like factoring everything together, Cimber is the complimentary guy. And that's why he's in my roster prediction that I put out on Sunday. But that was just for me personally. And I told you up front, I'm going to stick with it, that you're going to have ultimate veto power. If you're not convinced, you can stick with Curtis. But that's my case for Cimber.
I think this is kind of a toss-up, so I'm not going to necessarily veto you. I think that either guy could get the job. And this is kind of where Mattingly's style comes into play, right? When it comes to the bullpen. He likes guys in set roles. You know what I mean? So he might not value versatility, the fact that Curtis can pitch in multiple different roles, as much as he values what you talked about, which is giving guys different looks. So I think that's kind of where that old-fashioned, Donnie has talked a lot more about analytics over the past few years, but he's still Don Mattingly. He's still Donnie Baseball. You know what I mean? He's still an old-fashioned manager in the way that he sets his bullpen up to just kind of, he's not going to bring in his closer in the 8th inning because, he's facing 3, 4, 5. He's going to bring in his closer in the 9th inning. That's just the way Donnie does things, So I think you might be right in that they value the look over the versatility. Maybe in a different pen, like the one that John Curtis just came from, the Rays. They would value versatility because they think more analytically about their bullpen. But it's a toss-up. It could go either way. I wouldn't be surprised with either of these guys making the roster. How this bullpen shakes out, it's getting pretty interesting because they have a lot more arms than I think we thought, and that's why I said the bullpen's going to be better than we give it credit for because they have a lot of good arms. They had a lot of arms that looked really good in spring training, and they're running out of spots. And when you're running out of spots in the bullpen, you're not doing bad. So I think the Marlins have a good problem on their hand of it's kind of like the outfield in the future. They just have too many guys, and they just have to figure out which guys are going to be the right combination. And the truth is just the way, with the rotation, they're going to need Castano, they're going to need Neidert, they're going to need this, that, and the other. They're going to need Curtis, they're going to need Cimber, they're going to need Detweiler, they're going to need Pop, they're going to need Bender, they're going to need everybody in the pen because it's just how it is in Major League Baseball, right? 162 game season, especially in a COVID year. Injuries happen. COVID will probably happen this year. You got to be prepared for it. So they have a good, good depth to the point where when they need guys, they can bring them up. But so we're going to see all of these guys. We're definitely going to see Bender at some point. Mish mentioned that when he tweeted about it. But I think to start the year, it's a toss-up between Curtis and Cimber. Me personally, from my style, I would lean with Curtis. But I can see the Marlins taking Cimber because, like you said, they want to give guys a different look. And that is certainly a look that you don't see very often, the way he pitches. So.
Right. It's really complicated just because, to top all this off, I think it just deserves to be mentioning that they've been so fortunate this spring with health, with no major injuries, with the exception of Edward Cabrera. And Edward Cabrera is the one guy that we also want to see this season, and we expect to see this season. And he could be as good as anybody else. He has a nerve inflammation in his arm and isn't even throwing yet, so he's a little while away. But they're going to need a lot of starters over the course of the season because even the great ones at the top of this rotation, really outside of Sandy and Pablo, everybody else is going to have their innings watched very carefully. And at some point, they're not going to be pitching probably even 30 starts in a year. There's going to come a point where they pump the brakes on it because ultimately, the bigger objective for this team is probably 2022 and beyond, that they're not going to take any crazy risks during the season with individual players, especially those guys that are under long-term control and have even so much more upside to tap into. Other teams, their decisions are a lot easier because some of them have had significant injuries to guys that are already front runners for major league jobs. And we'll see if the Marlins do anything really sneaky here, if they place these guys on the IL with phantom injuries. That's something that has happened in previous years. Honestly, I thought they might do that with someone like Zach Pop at various points this spring because he's coming off Tommy John. Even though he's healthy, even though he looks great, he's inexperienced. And if you don't feel he's one of the best guys to start the season, then you're allowed to put him on the injured list and kind of ease him in as the season goes on. And they didn't do that. So I give them some credit for that, really believing in him. But that's what creates this big complication with everybody else because of his limitations. So far, though, from what we've seen, it seems that they're doing the best they can with these decisions. Nothing so far that I disagree with.
Can I just say that, from watching, this is the first spring training, right, that I've really been covering a team and really locked into how they make their decisions, what goes into the decision-making process, how much it changes day to day. And it's intense. Spring training, it's so much more difficult than, I ever imagined it to be, right? I thought you just kind of show up, you get ready for the season, you get your 25 guys in order, and you just kind of roll into the season, right? That's not really how it works. Guys perform. The Marlins had a lot of guys perform this spring. They had a lot of bullpen arms show up and pitch really well. And so it's making the decision really difficult. And Donnie, he talked about they have difficult decisions they have to make. They have to sit down, look at it, evaluate the full body of work, evaluate the spring, evaluate the stuff that these guys are working with, and kind of figured it all out. And they've got some really tough decisions on their hands. And maybe some teams, for some teams, the bigger teams where they have more established rosters, the Yankees and the Dodgers and the Cubs of the world, maybe it's a little easier. But for the Marlins, where you're trying to field a competitive team, but you're also trying to develop a lot of your young core at the same time, these decisions become a lot tougher, because it's like you want to win ball games, but you also want to get guys. Look, Donnie said they're done with giving guys opportunities. They want to win ball games. They're going to field the team that gives them the best opportunity to win games. And so I think when come opening day, come April 1st, come Thursday, you're going to see the 26 guys that give the Marlins the best chance to win 75, 80 games this year, I would say.
It will take so many over the course of the year to figure this out. Last year they used 61 players. Hopefully not that many. But it's not going to be
right. It's not going to be that many, because you're not going to have to build an entirely new roster because of a COVID outbreak. Hopefully, knock on wood. But they've stayed healthy this spring, and Donnie said they were very lucky. He kept telling us to knock on wood every day about injuries, and we should just keep doing that, because injuries are going to happen. And so, yeah, they're going to need everybody. They might need guys that we haven't talked about today. There's going to be some guys in AAA that they might need. Maybe they need a Braxton Garrett type. Maybe they need Edward Cabrera towards the end of the year. It's going to be interesting with him, because he's going to have to start throwing. Then he's going to have to get healthy. Then he's going to have to get built up and show them what they want to see from him, that he's developing enough, right, to pitch in the big leagues this year. Does Max Meyer make an appearance in the big leagues this year? It's all there's a lot of factors that the Marlins have right now that go into their roster. But they're going to at the end of the day, they're going to put out the 26 guys that give them the best chance to win.
Well, we appreciate everybody wherever you are listening to us. Now that we're on more and more platforms with this podcast, we thank everybody for listening, as breaking down this roster, not just for opening day. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of what they're going to do, managing all these players as the long season goes on. So you can find these wherever you get your podcasts on Fish Stripes. You can find this one on YouTube, assuming I uploaded correctly with no disasters. And me and Ethan Budowsky will be here throughout this crazy season, one that we think could go a lot better than the experts think, depending on luck, but depending on also how all these pieces fit together. At least for the start of the year, they seem to have a pretty good feel as to how to maximize the talent and make the whole better than the sum of their parts. So we're excited to see this play out, just a couple days away from opening day. And even once it gets started, it just gets crazier from there. So stick with us. We'll have plenty of coverage for you of the Marlins. And as always, go Fish.
Go Fish. Thanks, Eli.